cloak around me now.
Hello, everybody. Are you having fun? Excellent. Yeah, I've been having a great festival. So nice. Oh, there's Bob Curry. Hi. I'm looking for my other friends. I'm a Moose Javian, born and raised in Moose Jaw, graduated Central Collegiate in 1987, and my oldest friend, Robin, is in the audience with, oh, there she is, with the other Robin's mom, Louise Gerlevich. So, hi. It's always really, really nice to be home. I was telling some people in the last session, I walked into Crescent Park and I was just hit with a wall of emotion, like just burst, like thinking, oh, I remember feeding the ducks in this park with my grandma, and I remember swimming at the outdoor pool, and it's just it's lovely to come home. So thank you for having me. I'm also a writer and other things, but Moose Javian first, and I'm very excited to introduce Guy Vanderhaeghe. This is not the first time I interviewed Guy, lucky for you, because I had some time to get over my giddy fangirlness and check myself. I interviewed him during the COVID years when we did this online, we did the festival. Still, Guy Vanderhaeghe is a star, and the best kind of star, one who comes from Saskatchewan. His groundbreaking works have been shortlisted for all the awards, Giller Prize, Dublin Literary Awards, for example. Last Crossing won Canada Reads. He won the Governor General's Award 3 times. He's changed the way the world looks at the Western novel, yet he remains a modest Esterhazy boy. So I'll stop before I embarrass him. Please welcome Guy. Yeah, he's already embarrassed. Please welcome Guy Vanderhaeghe.
Thank you.
Last time when we talked online, and I think it was Harold Johnson and J.L. Richardson, and I was interviewing the three of you, and you said something that has stuck with me that I've thought about almost every day since then. You said, writing is so ephemeral, it's all ephemeral. You said, look at the Pulitzer Prize winners over the last decades, and you'll recognize hardly any of them. So you said the emphasis has to be on the work. And I think of that a lot, and it, wards off any hubris or pride, and it really puts the pleasure in the work and takes off the pressure of expectations. Yet, when you come out with a book like this, where they're publishing reviews you wrote in 1990, it's not all 1990s and until now, it's not all ephemeral. Like, your work is being remembered from decades ago. For a certain community, you will be remembered for a very long time, and they want to read everything you've written, even reviews. Does that make it seem less ephemeral to you?
Well, the British writer Cyril Connolly wrote a book called Enemies of Promise. And he said that he defined success if a book stayed in print for 10 years, which gives you an idea about the odds that writers face. I know how lucky I've been. Most of my books are still in print. But in the long haul, it's purely a fact that in any generation of writers or in any decade, longevity is difficult to achieve. And I don't think you ever know why a writer will last, why one writer will last and another one won't. And sometimes the writers who last are the ones who were ignored in their time. It's a bit of a lottery, which I'm not saying that talent doesn't have something to do with it. It obviously does, but also luck has something to do with it. And sometimes someone is right for the moment, that the times seem to demand certain kinds of books. So if you look at Margaret Atwood, right, you take a book like The Handmaid's Tale, which made a splash when it came out, then it made a later splash, because now it seems very prescient. It seems that in some fundamental way she was right about the way North America was going. So I don't, it's a hard question for me to answer because I don't spend a lot of time thinking whether my work will last or not. But if I'm being rational and logical, I know that the odds of it lasting, even 30 or 40 years into the future, are actually pretty slim.
I remember seeing a poet that I'm friends with on Facebook called the library to make an event, and they didn't know who he was. He said, "I've been forgotten before the end of my lifetime." That can be very heartbreaking if that's what you put the weight on. But I want to talk about this book. Because somebody asked me to, it's called, but actually more than one person asked you to. Can you tell us how this book came into being and who asked you to?
Well, I had a very early mentor by the name of Morris Wolfe, who in the 1970s and 1980s, he was an anthologist. He took one of my first short stories for an anthology published by Doubleday Canada. He wrote reviews for the sort of literary journal that existed then and no longer does. And then he started a press called Grub Street Press, and he wanted to collect the nonfiction that I had written over the years. And I thought of myself as a writer of fiction, that I wasn't a nonfiction writer. And so I said no to him. And he tried to persuade me, and I said, no, I don't think I should do that. Then I sort of lost touch with him over time, and then I saw that he had died. And when I read that, I felt really, really guilty for turning him down. So I started going back and looking at those pieces that I had written over a period basically from 1983 up until the present, and I decided that I would attempt to get them published in memory to him. So this book is dedicated to him. And it's a weird compilation. It's, I was going to say humorous pieces, but one shouldn't say humorous if you've written it, because you run a big risk, right? In judgment, but also book reviews. I've been asked to do talks at universities or to writers groups. So in some ways, it's all over the map. But when I started putting it together with an editor, I began to see certain patterns emerging in the book about the obsessions I had as a writer and continuing interests I had over time, and also my attitudes towards writing, and also increasingly probably starting about 20 years ago, my worries about the political state of the world, which surfaced in novels and occasionally in talks that I gave. And I knew I would never write a memoir, but there are parts of this book that talk about my childhood, that talk about my university years. They're scattered through different pieces.
Talk about your marriage a little bit?
Yeah, about my marriage and my relationship with certain publishers and figures in publishing. And it seemed to me that a kind of portrait of a period emerged in which CanLit was sort of getting its feet under itself, and that people of my generation were benefiting from what people like Atwood and Monroe and Margaret Lawrence, and I could...
Mavis Glant.
Yeah, Mavis Glant, a whole list of names. But they had helped make CanLit respectable when for a long time it wasn't. And there seemed to be a certain excitement, or at least I felt there was a certain excitement about Canadian writing and Canadian culture, which I think in some respects, all of these different pieces give a particular view. I mean, I almost think that it's like a circus tent, right? And there's all sorts of holes all around the tent, and you could look through any hole and get a slightly different picture of what was going on in my life or the writing world or even academia over a period that now is over 40 years long.
Wow, it doesn't feel like that long. But
Yeah, well, I mean, I published my first book in 1982. So that's 43 years ago.
Wow.
And I wondered what happened to me, even though I can recognize the guy in his young 30s who published that first book in myself now, but I also know how much I changed over that time.
I want to come back to talking about book culture and CanLit, which is what we're mostly going to talk about, but you mentioned that you would never write a memoir, and I found myself wondering that because these pieces are all public pieces that have been published, and I wondered if you would ever publish your letters, but I'm guessing based on that you would never publish a collection of letters?
No.
How come? You're like, no.
No, I mean, like the letters, the interesting part is what people wrote to me. Right? Not what I wrote to them.
Well, to you, that's the interesting part.
Okay, so, and that to me would kind of feel like an invasion of privacy, even though, unfortunately, a lot of people are dead. Now, I remember the archivist at the University of Calgary sidling up to me and saying, "You and Richler are two strange dudes." Right? Because she had Richler's letters to me and my letters to Richler.
Oh.
Right?
So they are in archives then, your
Yeah.
letters. Okay.
Yeah. But I don't, it's not.
Does nobody nobody has permission to publish them during your
No.
lifetime? But after
No.
your lifetime, someone could publish them?
Well, I don't know. What can I do?
Right.
I
Nothing.
But at least if they happen to be published, I'm not responsible for them being published. You know, it's not my say.
What kind of strange things
I
did you write
can be like
about?
Pontius Pilate. My hands are clean.
Yeah.
You decided.
Tell us the strange things you wrote about.
Well, I mean, he was always a jokey guy, right? And once he got a fax machine, he went nuts, right? he could fire off anything in an instant, and he did. Like John Fraser was made the head of Massey College in Toronto, and there were certain people that Richler loved tormenting. So he would send letters to Massey College when he was in London and he would be pretending to be a fence for the silver in Massey College that John Fraser was apparently stealing and sending to London to be sold, right? And this would arrive at the secretary's desk in Toronto, and he thought it was hilarious. And it was hilarious, right? Except if you were John Fraser, it wasn't hilarious, right?
The idea of people faxing letters fits in with my next question, because I was just thinking as I read this constantly about how much book culture has changed, how much the world has changed. And so you're writing these long reviews that are meaty and that are smart. But there's no place for that anymore, is there? There's
Doesn't
not
seem
even
to
really
be.
short reviews. So is it so the audience for those would be not academics, they're not published in an academic journal, but for intelligent, regular people who are interested in reading about books. Has the audience gone? Is that why the reviews are gone, or what's happened?
Okay. You don't have an audience if you don't provide the material for the audience.
Yeah.
So I know that newspapers are under a lot of financial strain, right? I tend to think that people are as smart now as they ever were. The problem is, I think, that media thinks that they aren't. And so they don't give people much to think about. I don't think television gives people much to think about. I don't think the internet gives people much to think about. Newspapers, outside of covering basic news and certain political opinion pieces, don't give people much to think about. So it is a different world. I mean, there was a time, in one of these pieces I talk about, when Trump started appearing on the scene, one of the things that I noted is that there was no American writer who was given an opportunity to comment on the American scene. Mm-hmm. If you look back in time, Vietnam or anything else, American writers were prominent in discussing social and political issues, and they were given a forum to do it. Gore Vidal, Norman Mailer, and you could go on and on about a list of, poets, Robert Lowell, people who were engaged by their society and what was happening in the society. But newspapers and journals thought that there was a certain prestige attached to having an important writer appear in their pages. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's true anymore.
No.
I think I sometimes say that writers who write literary fiction are a bit like weavers in Britain in the late 18th century. That industrialization was going to make them obsolete. There were highly paid people in Britain who did nothing but snip the nubs off woven cloth, hand-woven cloth. And they were actually quite well paid for doing it. I sometimes think that we writers, somebody's going to take our shears away on us, pretty soon, and we won't be cutting the nubs off the cloth anymore.
I was going to say, when he said it wasn't well respected or rewarded, I was going to say, but at least it's fun writing literary fiction. But then I remember the metaphor used backstage. Do you remember?
Well, I mean,
he said it was like having a rusty nail driven into your head.
It's very contradictory. There was a time in my life where I felt compelled to write. Mm-hmm. It was a compulsion, but I never found it fun.
Did you feel good after you finished writing?
No.
No, I didn't see it. No.
Because then you start thinking about how you could have done it better.
Right.
Like, when I used to do readings, I would start reading a piece and I would start editing it as I read it, right? Oh, wrong word. I'm changing that word as I read it, right? And I'm not saying this is true of every writer or that every writer should feel the torment that I do, right? But I get very little satisfaction from writing. I admit it's odd and it's contradictory because I spent my whole life doing this. So why did I do it? I was compelled.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm like an addict, right? A heroin addict. You know it's bad for you, right?
Any aspiring writers in the audience are just leaving, sneaking out.
Yeah. Well, when I was teaching creative writing, I always felt that it was incumbent on me to warn people, right? To encourage them, but also warn them. And I would say, if you think you're going to make a whole bunch of money being a writer, you're better off buying lottery tickets, right? That's not what it's about. And I used to say, because often I would have a 21 or 22-year-old student who had some sort of romantic idea about what it meant to be a writer. And I used to say to them, do you want to be a writer with a capital W, or do you want to write?
It's a great question.
Yeah, in my mind.
You wanted to do neither, but.
Yeah, but no. You know, there's it's the act, I think, of writing, and the attempt to make whatever you're writing as good as it possibly can be. And I don't think it's about thinking about where doing that might get you.
No. That'll drive a person crazy.
Yeah,
Did anyone heed your warnings?
I assume so.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the statistics about
They all heeded your warnings.
about people who publish books after coming out of creative writing programs, they either heeded my warning or they ran up against the facts of the world.
Yeah.
Right?
One or the other. Back to their book reviews for a while. So you were there while the reviews were long, and now we have no reviews. I assume that didn't happen overnight. Was it a gradual process? Did you see it coming? And if so, do you see further changes in book culture coming?
You know, I actually don't think it was so much. Change is always coming, but I think what accelerated it was the destruction of newspapers. And that was the internet. Because the internet, the assumption was that it provided information, and it does provide information, right? It tended to destroy the financial basis of newspapers. So when newspapers were making money, and they were making often a lot of money through advertising and everything else, they were willing to sort of subsidize book pages. And it was also a prestige sort of thing. I remember when Conrad Black set up the National Post, and it started with a big book page section. And then the Globe and Mail expanded their book page section.
I love that book page section while it existed.
Yeah. So, and like there was a point when people were asking me to write book reviews, and the Globe and Mail said to me, well, you can't write for both papers. And I said, well, I guess I'll write for the National Post then, right? And then they said, well, yeah, you can write for, you know.
Actually, we've thought about it.
we can do that, right? And it was because I think that the editors felt the way I did about book reviewing, that book reviews were essential to help find the right audience for a book, but they were also essential for writers because writers needed to feel that they and their work were being taken seriously. And that it seemed to me was the one reason why I wrote book reviews, because you didn't get paid anything for doing it. Like when you thought about what your
10
time
cents a
was.
word or something like
Yeah,
that?
it's a
couple $100.
Yeah, it would take at least a minimum, or at least took me a minimum of a week to write a book review.
Read the book, read it again.
Yeah, you had to read the book, you had to think about it, you had to make notes, you had to attempt to write a piece, and then you had to attempt to make it coherent, all of that sort of stuff. It just took a lot of time to do. To do what I thought was what I considered a decent job. But I thought it was important. I didn't think it was important that I write the reviews, but I thought it was important that reviews be written and that reviews be serious.
And these ones are, they seem amazing from today's standards. It's hard to believe there was ever such a thing, like 4 or 5 page, 6-page book reviews. Like
Yeah.
mini essays.
Yeah.
Not even that mini, an essay.
Yeah.
Did you, when you got a good review, did you feel that way, that it made your work, that made you that someone recognized your work was serious, or did you hate that part too?
I'm sorry.
I'm picking on him now.
I didn't catch.
I said, or did you hate that part too? Did the book reviews make like, were they that important to you in that way as a writer? When someone did a review, a good thoughtful review or a good review on your work, it made you feel like your work was being taken serious.
And even if you got a bad review that was an intelligent review, then you could say, well, yeah, I actually need to think about what that person said about my work, right? Of course, every writer wants good reviews, right? Like nobody said, I'm hoping for a really bad review of this book, right? But when you get a bad review, but in one sense it's good in that it's thoughtful and it takes the work seriously, and it points out its defects, then you can say, I've got something to learn from this review.
I think publishers are acting like maybe that has been replaced by Goodreads, which I disagree with. I don't know how you feel about Goodreads.
Well, I disagree with too. I mean, everybody's entitled to their opinion, okay? But I still think some opinions are better than others.
More educated than others.
No, it's like, if somebody comes to me with a cancer problem, am I more qualified to talk about it or an oncologist?
Yeah.
Likely the oncologist knows more about cancer than I do, right? And I tend to think that people who write know more about writing than people who don't write. So an opinion's an opinion, and everyone's entitled to it. There's stuff that I hate. So, anybody who goes on any of these sites, they get to say what they want and they feel, and that's valid, right? One of the things that I like to do, which is interesting, is that to take writers who I really admire, and then look how they are reviewed.
On Goodreads,
right? Yeah, on Goodreads or on Amazon, they're actually usually rated pretty low.
Yeah, and some of the things people say are hilarious, the criticisms,
Yeah, and so publishers think it provides a function. Yes, the function it provides, it helps to sell books. It tends to help to sell certain kinds of books. And that's perfectly okay, right? But I'm like Cynthia Ozick. She said, I don't find entertainment very entertaining, right? Yeah. There's a certain kind of book that I like, right? And a lot of people don't like that kind of book.
So this book is meant for general readership and not for academics, yet I could see it being really useful to an academic, to someone who's writing about your novels and could come back to this and see what your preoccupations were at certain times and who your influences were, and have it all nicely collected in one place. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about who some of your main influences were? Because I think we tend to think about people that you have influenced, that your work has influenced. So it's interesting to go back and think about who has influenced you.
Well, one of the things is that I think my influences are very disparate. But the first essay that I was asked to write, Canadian Literature asked me to write about influences on my work when I published one book, which I kind of found hilarious, but they asked me to do it, so I did it. And when I started thinking about it, one of the things that struck me is that maybe, and I put quotation marks around this, bad writing is as influential on writers as good writing. And one of the interesting things is that Vladimir Nabokov, who is thought of as kind of the premier aesthetician when it comes to writing, in his memoir, Speak Memory, he talks a lot about Captain Mayne Reid, who wrote late 19th century thrillers. I got really curious about that, and I started reading Captain Mayne Reid online, not at that point online, but I had access to a university library. And I could see how his prose style appeared in Nabokov's English. Now, purified, distilled, right? But I think he was an influence. And with me, like, some of the influences were the boys' adventure books that I read as a kid. And there was something called the Boys' Own Annual, which was a 19th century, early 20th century series of, they were English and they were serialized stories. And there was a little old English lady who lived down the street, and she had bought these for her children, and she gave them to me, right? And they just, like, I found them fascinating. But because they were serials, I would be reading a story, and then it would stop, and I wouldn't have the next, the next segment. So I'd invent what was happening, right?
Is that the first time you started writing stories? Was those inventions?
Well, in my head.
Oh, in your
right?
head.
I was like, okay, what's going to happen? And I think I ended this essay in saying that probably the way I write is influenced in many ways, either unconsciously or subconsciously, by the simple question. I didn't put this in the essay, but what happens next?
Yeah.
What happens next? If this happens, what does it lead to? So, if I were to talk about writers who influenced me, there was a whole series of Canadian writers who were really, really important to me when I started writing. Most of them women, actually. Ethel Wilson, Margaret Lawrence, Alice Munro, Mavis Gallant, Margaret Atwood. But
what age were you reading these women writers?
Well, at that point in my early 20s, because this was the first kind of burst of CanLit on the scene. And I remember my wife bought me Atwood Surfacing for a birthday present, and it was the first thing I'd read by her.
1970s, is that when you read it, right when it was out, kind of?
But I was reading Rudy Weeb and all those people, but I was also reading a lot of European literature, which I've always been a big fan of, the Russians in particular, but also the Central Europeans like Robert Musil and Witold Gombrowicz and all of these other people. Like, what I wanted, as a reader, what I wanted to do was get a sense of the history of Western European and North American literature. And that meant that I felt that I had to read as widely as possible, whether it was Italo Svevo, and all of this was in translation. I wasn't reading any of these in the original languages. But I was a voracious reader, and I just read and read and read, and I think I taught myself to write by reading. Like, I never took a creative writing class. I never went to see a writer in residence, any of those sorts of things. I sat at home, and I read and I wrote. And so my influences are kind of like from all over the place, and I can't quite separate where something comes from. Like, I loved the English satirical writers like Evelyn Waugh and Anthony Powell, and just, the verbal wit and their sense of the absurdity of life. I mean, I love that, and I think I inject some of that in my work. I hope I do. But I was also, attracted to the kind of moral and ethical questions that obsessed the Russians. And because I studied history at university, I was interested in history, and I was interested in politics, and so I had a great respect for what I would call political writers, like George Orwell, who attempted to engage with the politics of the day. But the question, you would think that I'd be able to answer it pretty easily, and name like 3 writers who were the biggest influences on me. But when I stop and think about it, I would, if you asked me that question today and then tomorrow and the day after, each day I'd probably come up, if I were said 5, you have to name 5 people, there'd be 5 different people.
I think it would be interesting if there's any graduate students in the audience, if nobody's yet done a master's thesis on how those boy westerns influenced you and how you use them as a stepping stone, and that would be an interesting master's thesis. Not to you, I know.
No.
You're like, that would be awful. I think that'd be an interesting master's thesis.
I've always been interested in what I would call reshaping what is often called genre fiction.
Yeah.
Right?
That's evident.
So I haven't gotten very far into it, and I don't know if I'll continue writing it or whatever. I'm interested in writing a novel now that takes some of the tropes of the hard-boiled detective novel and trying to do something different with it. Just the way I think, or I hope I did something different with the Western.
Interesting. You did. One of my favorite pieces was the Margaret Lawrence lecture you did. I've only been to that once. I think it was Guy Gavriel Kay did it the time I went to it, but I love that lecture, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what exactly Margaret Lawrence meant to you as an influence.
Well, I have to sort of back up a little bit here. My first book, Man Descending, improbably won the Governor General's Award. And one of the other books that was nominated at the time I was nominated was Alice Munro for a collection of short stories. My book was a collection of short stories too. I knew that my book was not as good as her book, but I won.
You say that in the essay, yes. Yeah, you're working your head around that.
Yeah. For me, that was simply a fact. So I felt really sort of kind of guilty about that. On the other hand, it was a conflicted guilt because I knew that the money was good. I was pretty poor. I wanted the money, and I knew that it would
open doors.
It would give me at that time there weren't a lot of prizes. Now there are a lot of prizes, but at that point the GG was the big prize, and I got it, right? So that was good.
How old were you? About
32, I guess. So I wrote a letter of apology to Alice Munro, and because she blurbed my book, right? She blurbed my book, and I won when I shouldn't have. And then I almost kind of hit I've never suffered from writer's block, because I always think that writer's block is something that you drag yourself up and over, like you just keep on doing it until you get over it. And I was really sort of down in the mouth. I wanted to write a novel, and I wasn't really doing anything. And then improbably, out of the blue, I got this letter from Margaret Lawrence. I'd never met Margaret Lawrence. I'd admired her writing, all the rest of it. And she said something like, I hope you don't think it's presumptuous of me, but I want to give you some advice. right? As the older writer, she said Ethel Wilson had done that for her, and so that she wanted to do that for me. And so she warned me about all the stuff that I should watch out for, okay? And then she said, you know, the only reason that I do this is because, and I almost get embarrassed to say this, you've got the gift, right?
The divining gift, she called it
Yeah,
in her work.
and that gave me a boost of confidence, right? I never met Margaret Lawrence. Of course, I wrote her a thank you letter, all the rest of it. I never got a chance to tell her what that letter had meant to me and how it sort of got me out of the doldrums that I was in. So then the Writers' Union of Canada asked me to give what's called the Margaret Lawrence Lecture. So indirectly, I got a chance to thank her because I told the story at the beginning of the lecture. So, you know, it's sort of like Blanche Dubois, you know, getting by on the kindness of strangers. Somebody who I didn't know sent me a very kind letter out of the blue and said, you know, I've read your book. I think it's a really good book. And so this is what you should keep in mind going into the future as a writer.
I love that story. It gives me goosebumps, and I'd already read the story in the book, but it gave me goosebumps again. I love Margaret Lawrence. She's one of the people that made me think, wow, you can write about the prairies? It's important to write about the prairies?
And she came from just over the border in Manitoba from where I grew up. So I could recognize locales that she used in her novels.
So I love to hear that she was a good person, too. What a wonderful thing to do for someone. Have you ever paid it forward and done that to a young writer? I guess we all the time when you're teaching.
I still, I've young writers that I correspond with, by email now.
Not fax anymore?
Pardon?
Not fax anymore?
No. Or snail mail. And if they ask for advice, I try and give them advice.
We don't have very much long, so I'm going to open it up for questions with 10 minutes left, so we have a few more minutes. But you had written, the health of a country's artistic community is a sign of the health of its democracy. So first, how do you think Saskatchewan's doing? And then, how is the state of U.S. democracy reflected in its writing? Just a little question. If you could answer that.
Well, one of the interesting things, it seems to me, is that authoritarian governments of all kinds hate democracy, and they hate art. So one of the interesting things is, what is Trump doing now? He shut down the National Endowment for the Arts. He's taken away the money for NPR, for public broadcasting. He's appointing stooges to the National Arts Center in Washington. Basically, people, I would argue, who are inimical to democracy feel that way about art. And I wrote an essay in which I said that art is a way of thinking. And that what art recognizes is that there's really no absolutely clear-cut answers to the things we would like to have absolutely clear-cut answers to.
You say that art is the opposite of propaganda.
Yeah. George Orwell famously said, all art is propaganda. And in this essay, I said, excuse me, Mr.
Orwell.
No, you're wrong, right? Because propaganda actually dispenses with nuance, whereas art deals with complexity. So and I know they think it's their job, but when politicians focus on simple answers to complex problems, democracy's in trouble.
Yeah.
So the more simple-minded the politician is, and sometimes you wonder, can they get any more simple-minded? You know that democracy is in trouble. When you get to be an old fart, you always start like things were better in the past, right? And I want to be careful not to do that. But I think things have gotten worse politically.
I think we could take a vote on that, and it'd be,
Well,
everyone would
but the
agree.
thing is that, if I were to be Pollyanna-ish, which is not my inclination, I think that the Canadian response to what Trump has been doing about Canada might be hopeful, right?
Elbows up sort of
Well,
scenario.
not even just elbows up, but actually thinking of the country as a country that goes from sea to sea to sea, right? I grew up in the West, so I know all about regional grievances, right? And I had some of those when I was a beginning writer, when I would think that coming from the West meant that Toronto ignored you, which was, I think, sort of true, right? But I think that we have, here, I'm climbing on my hobby horse here. I think that we have to start searching, and this is true all over the world, for what we have in common rather than what divides us. And I think Trump may have got us thinking a little bit more about what we have in common. I used to, I kept on thinking the Oliver Goldsmith novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. When I was about 21, I read that and I thought, I want a serene old age like the Vicar of Wakefield, sort of bathed in everything being okay. I'm not having a serene old age. I mean,
No
I'm
kidding.
anxious and I'm angry. I'm pissed off, right? I don't want to be pissed off all the time when I'm 74,
No.
right? I want to just sort of sit back and enjoy stuff, but I am.
Have you written about your piss-offedness?
I started on, but it was in COVID. I started writing a long nonfiction piece drawing comparisons and distinctions between what was happening in the United States and the 1930s in Europe. But every time I sort of thought that I'd gotten to the point where things couldn't get any stranger and weirder, right? They would get stranger and weirder, right? And then when I finally got it done, things had gone so far past what I had written that what I had written had no relevance. And I kind of felt like I've been going down this rabbit hole, right? Sitting, staring at CNN, reading, newspapers online, discovering one bit of weirdness after another. And I don't want to go down that hole anymore, right? But I was trying to make sense of it, but it couldn't make sense. Like QAnon conspiracies. If someone, as I said in this essay, I remember saying it, if someone presented to a psychiatrist with these symptoms in 1980, they would have been, as they say in Britain, sectioned, right? They would just say, you need to spend some time in a hospital.
Yeah. Yes. I have so many more questions because it's such a privilege to sit and talk to Guy Vanderhaeghe. I sometimes can't believe the luck of my own life, largely due to the wonderful festival who gives me these opportunities. But I do not want to hog all of his time, so we're going to open it up so that you can ask some questions. And if you don't have any questions, I'm just going to keep talking to him. Good. Right in the front. Yeah, microphone's coming your way.
I read somewhere that all art is basically subversive, as seen from the point of view of an authoritarian leader.
Excuse me,
I can repeat the questions,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So carry on.
Yeah, go.
And I wonder how you perceive art as well. And I just wanted to make a comment. I love your comments on Margaret Lawrence and how she communicated with you and that. And this summer, I made the pilgrimage to Nipawin to see the Margaret Lawrence house and the Stone Angel, by the way. But
Oh, cool.
I think that art and poetry, well, poetry is often the poets are often the first people authoritarians oppress. If you look at Pinochet in Chile, and a lot of authoritarian regimes. So I think you people, you artists, are really on the front lines for us in a lot of ways. Anyway, what do you think? What would you...
Okay, so we're in trouble. You have bad hearing and I have a bad memory, and he did the question first, but I
Well,
think the question...
I got it when the microphone...
The first part was all art is
kicked in.
subversive, of authoritarian regimes, and how do you respond?
Okay. I mean, the thing, it's been particularly true of poets in authoritarian regimes in places like, for instance, Russia, or, you're talking about Pinochet, because poetry is a form of code, right? It doesn't explicitly say stuff. That didn't stop Stalin from killing Mandelstam, right? But poetry in really, really repressive regimes gets to say things, or to attempt to say things, that it's almost impossible to do in prose. Now, we're nowhere near that in North America or even in the United States. I mean, the States, I think, is going down a bad path, but it's not a totalitarian country. It may come close to that. I think it's the nature of art to be subversive, because as I wrote in this little essay, art asks questions. Like Chekhov said, it's not the duty of an artist to provide a solution, it's the duty of the artist to state the problem correctly. And in stating the problem correctly, I think that causes the people in power some discomfort. So just last night, I was looking at TV, and there's a documentary about Teddy Roosevelt, who was kind of the father of American imperialism, right? And it was Mark Twain who stridently criticized Roosevelt when Roosevelt was at the height of his popularity, and American troops were killing thousands of Filipinos in the Philippines because the United States wanted control of the Philippines. The one thing about at least successful artists is that they get to say things because they have a measure of independence. They don't have a boss. So as long as they have a certain amount of autonomy, they have a freedom to say things. And I think it's also the nature of artists is to sort of swim against the tide a bit, right? To feel that we're all going down a certain path, and maybe we should think that, is this the right path, or is there things that may be wrong with the path we're taking? Now, that makes, when I say that, that makes artists almost sound in some ways as being prophetic and saintly. They aren't necessarily so. There have been a lot of artists who've had very, very bad opinions about all sorts of things, monstrous opinions. So artists aren't infallible, but I think they tend to be people who ask questions. I think that's the best that I can say about them.
My ex-husband once said to me, there's a name for people like you. I can't remember what it is, but when the conquerors come, they kill your kind first.
Right?
Oh, he was funny.
She laughed in the face of death.
Any other questions? I have one while we're waiting. So the most personal part of this collection is the parts where you talk about your marriage and what it's like being married to another creative, because often in a couple you have one non-creative to like buy the groceries and things, but you talk about both the rewards and the challenges of being with someone else who's a creative. Can you talk a little bit about your life together as two artists?
Well, I mean, one of the things is that we understood each other at the level of neither one of us were likely to say to the other one, you ought to go out and get a job, right? My wife was a painter. And in fact, the way we lived, I remember, because she had a studio we were living in a rented duplex at that time. She had a studio in the basement, and I was writing at home. And there was a lady across the street who we obviously drove crazy because she finally couldn't stand it anymore, and she came over and rang the doorbell and said, I have to ask you, what do you people do? You never leave the house. No, she knew we weren't drug dealers because there wasn't a lot of traffic, going in and out of the house. So that's good, in some ways that you're both on the same page and that you both have, if it's not a common interest, you understand what the other person's trying to do. But in practical terms, it's a disaster, right? Because there was never any stable source of income for a long time. Though I suppose my wife did actually whip me into shape, because down the street, the dean of St. Thomas More College in Saskatchewan came. He knocked on our door one day and he said, would you teach creative writing at college? And I said, no, I don't want to do that. And
She said, yes, you do want to do that.
And then he started going down the street, and my wife said, are you crazy? Right? You call him up. So, it's the practical stuff is difficult, and then there's another difficulty in that I think that many artists of whatever kind sort of live in their own space, and so they can be lost to the other person because they're focused on whatever they're doing. I certainly have no regrets. I think my wife died 13 years ago, and we were together from the time I was 20 and she was 21, and we were more or less always on the same page about what we thought the other person needed to do what they were doing.
I think that's beautiful.
And I have a piece in this book about us going, when we finally decided we were going to buy a house,
I love that's what I was thinking. You manage, like you've got the house you wanted.
Yeah.
So financially.
So we go to the bank, and the guy's talking to us, and he says to me, "So what do you do?" And I said, "I'm a writer." And he said, "You write for the Star Phoenix?" And I said, "No, I don't write for the Star Phoenix." He said, "Well, what do you write?" I said, "Well, I write short stories and novels." And as I say in the piece, he looked over at my wife with a hopeful look on his face, praying that she might be a registered nurse, and said to her, "And what do you do?" And she said, "I'm a painter." And he said, "House painter?" So there's, like, when we rented, we always lied about what we did, right? Because they would ask, like, "What do you do?" And I had written some consulting reports, for a guy who hired me to write reports. I said, "I'm a consultant," right? Yeah, people are suspicious of artists.
Well, we're out of time, but this has been delightful. Thank you very much for the conversation,
Angie.
and thank you for listening.
Yeah.
One thing I can tell you, you're good when you're tired. Come on over, start talking to me. One thing I can tell, you're good when you're tired. On a train.